The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. This is Rosalía Manolos, Director of Asset Management here at TDHCA. Apologize for the delayed start. We were having technical difficulties this morning, so I apologize for that. Like I said, I'm the Director of Asset Management. I have been with the department since 2007 and working on cost certifications pretty much since then. Helping me on this webinar, I have Lucy Trevino, who is one of the senior asset managers, and Leanne Chance, another senior asset manager. Patricia Murphy is also providing assistance with the presentation. So thank you all for joining us. A few housekeeping items before we begin the webinar. Please note, this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel for future listening. The control panel will automatically collapse during the course of this presentation. To open the control panel, select the orange arrow. When you open your control panel, you can select whether or not you want to call into the dial-in number or use your computer's audio. Choose computer audio to use your computer's audio features. If you're having issues with the sound quality, we recommend that you call in. If you choose phone call, once you select the phone option, GoToWebinar will show you a phone number and access code. Use this information to call in. If you hang up and wish to call in again, you may need to wait for a few minutes so that the system recognizes you are no longer logged in and allows you to complete your call. If you hang up and call back in right away, you may get a busy signal or some other error. Also, if you called in for the webinar with the dial-in number but did not register online, you will not be able to participate. You must use the link to register if you wish to speak. If you are having issues with your computer microphone, you can use the sound check button in the audio control to help troubleshoot. We will be answering questions during this webinar, but only those questions that are general in nature. If you have a question about a specific transaction, please contact the asset manager directly. If you have questions during this presentation, please submit the question using the question box and include your name, your question, and indicate if you wish to speak. Thank you for your participation. The purpose of this roundtable is to provide an overview of the cost certification requirements and process here at TDHCA. This is not intended to be a full training on cost certification, but it will provide a good overview of what the process includes. Also, the idea for this roundtable is to generate ideas for improvement from the outside if there are any. You do not have to submit your ideas during the presentation, but you're welcome to follow up with me after the presentation is done. At the end of the slides, there will be my contact information, so please submit emails to me or call me if you have any items that you wish to discuss. Could we go on? Thank you. And just as a general comment, some of the attendees indicated that they wanted to know if there were any big changes. There haven't been any significant changes to the cost certification process, so this is really more of a refresher, or if you're new to the process, this will give you a general understanding of what we do. First of all, why is there a cost certification? Basically, because the IRS requires it. We, as the housing agency, are supposed to allocate credits in an amount that is not to exceed the amount necessary to assure project feasibility. And this determination is made when the application for credits is submitted and once placement in service occurs. So that's the cost certification stage. Section 10.402J of TANTAC is the rule that governs the cost certification requirements at the state level. So that is the actual rule that identifies all the different items that have to be submitted for this cost certification package. Other considerations as to what goes into a cost certification is Chapter 2306 of the Texas Government Code. This is the statute that governs us. TANTAC Chapter 11, Subchapter D, this is the underwriting rules and guidelines. And then TANTAC 10404, which deals with the reserve requirements for asset management. On Chapter 2306, there are underwriting and feasibility requirements that have to be considered. Amendment requirements. So one of the things that we do at cost certification is confirm that the development as built is the same or not significantly different than what was proposed at application. That section of Chapter 2306 deals with what is considered material. So one of the checks that we do at cost certification is go through the list of items and compare what was proposed at application to what was actually built. The same thing with the ownership transfers. So section 2306.6713 deals with the ownership transfers. So we, as part of the cost certification package, go back and look at the organizational chart and confirm that there haven't been changes that would require approval from the department. As it relates to Chapter 11, Subchapter D, you all may be familiar with the underwriting rules at application. So a similar analysis is conducted at the cost certification stage. Many of the underwriting rules from application apply at cost certification. So the same analysis that was done at the time of application is being done once the development has been built. So a lot of the frequent findings are things that would have been addressed at the time of application underwriting as well. And then the reserve requirements that I'll get into in a little bit more detail down the road, but just know that 10.404 has some provisions regarding reserves. So just a few general comments about what we do and how things are organized in asset management. The cost certification process is one of the functions that we handle in asset management. For that, we have a post-award activities manual that describes the requirements for the different functions. This web page that is identified on the screen has a link to the post-award activities manual, and then within it, you'll see the table of contents includes cost certification as one of these sections. So this is where you would go to find the information for cost certification, including the forms that have to be completed, and then the manual will provide a walkthrough of the different requirements. As far as who does the review of the cost certification, the state is divided into 13 service regions, and the regions are divided between asset managers here at TDHCA. The map that you see on the screen has the regions color-coded by the different asset managers. So when you're getting ready to submit your cost certification, it is going to be submitted to the applicable asset manager. The tool on the right of the screen has the counties divided by asset manager. So if you enter in the county in which your property is located, you will, it will identify who the asset manager is for that property. Once the cost cert package is submitted, the communication regarding the review will begin with the asset manager. So what are the cost certification requirements? First of all, it's due January 15th, following the first year of the elected credit period. Extensions can be requested. If you request an extension at least 30 days in advance of the deadline, there is no fee. If the extension is requested within 30 days or after the deadline, there is a fee. The package that has to be submitted to TDHCA will consist of a PDF file that has forms that you'll find on our website in an Excel file and supplemental documentation. In addition to that PDF, you'll submit the actual cost certification Excel file. So it's two pieces that you'll be submitting for our review. As far as the process goes, staff will attempt to review the cost certification within 45 days of submission, and then any follow-up reviews. So once a request for information is submitted, the asset manager will try to review that within 30 days of receipt. On average, the cost certification process takes about 3 requests for informations, and then 86-9s are issued approximately within 6 months. That timing can be less, but it can also be more. And really, it depends on how responsive the owners are once we send out a request for information. In some instances, we don't get responses from owners months, or in some cases, the cost cert sits around for even years. So if the owner wants to have 8609s issued in a timely manner, we have to get responses to the RFIs fairly quickly as well. And then obviously the fewer RFIs, the better. So if we have a package that has very few questions, then we can move through that quickly. Another thing that has to be completed typically for the issuance of 8609s is the final construction inspection. However, currently, because of the COVID-19 situation, this requirement is being waived by the executive director on a case-by-case basis. Depending on the status of the final inspection, if it has been conducted, and depending on the findings that are identified, the executive director can waive the requirement. However, in some instances, if the findings can be corrected, the expectation is that those findings will be corrected before the 8609s are issued. So staff will communicate with the development owner regarding the status, and if it is warranted, a waiver will be processed internally for the 8609s to be issued. As far as the approval process, for the 8609s, the asset manager spends the most time with the file, so they'll do the initial review, send out requests for information, review the responses, and once everything has been addressed, the file will be sent to me for review. I typically spend maybe a week or a couple of weeks, depending on the workload, to get to the file. Once I approve it, it goes back to the compliance division for a check on the compliance status of the development. If everything is clean, then it goes to the deputy executive director for final approval before coming back to me for the actual signature of the 8609s. And like I said, this process can take typically from a couple of months to a lot longer, depending on the issues that are identified in our review. Do we have any questions from anyone at this time?
Nope, there are no questions.
No questions. Thank you, Patricia. So what is included in the cost certification? This slide has a list of all the different tabs within the cost certification, and each of them serves a different purpose. So I'll just briefly go through each of them. The owner certification is a statement that we have the owner complete, basically saying that cost certification is true and complete, that all the information has been submitted, and there are a couple other disclaimers in there that have to be signed off on. The owner summary and organizational charts, as I was mentioning earlier, one of the checks that we do is comparing the ownership structure at application to the ownership structure once the development had been completed. So that is the information that we go to. And then the owner summary just provides us a contact to reach out to regarding the cost certification. So all of that is identified in that second bullet point. The carryover or determination notice, well, that just gives us something to start out with. In the case of a 9% deal, the carryover identifies the originally approved credit amount, which is the maximum that can be issued at cost cert. And then for a 4% development, the determination notice is the commitment for the credits, but the credit amount can change. Along with the determination notice, there's an election statement regarding the applicable credit percentage. So we use that for analysis purposes. Evidence of nonprofit or hub participation. So on the 9% development, if the property got points for having a nonprofit or a hub, they are supposed to give us information about the hub's participation or the nonprofit's participation. So it's just double checking what was identified at application. The development team list, that's just a summary of the bigger players in the development. So it'll have the developer, the contractor, the architect, the engineer, the CPA, and several others. So just giving us a summary of who was involved in the development team. It will identify whether they are related parties, whether any of them are hubs. It has contact information. So it's just, again, a summary of who was involved in getting this deal done. The development summary with the architect certification, that is the document that tells us what the development looks like. So it's signed by the architect. It identifies the square footage, the site area, so acreage, all of the amenities that are present at the development. And all of that is compared to what we expected at the time of application and what is reflected in the LURA. So one of the checks that the asset managers will do is check out that exhibit to see that the required number of points for common amenities, unit amenities, have been met and that there haven't been any significant changes to the development from what was proposed at application. The as-built survey goes along those lines, so it just gives us an overview of what the site looks like. It has to be prepared by a professional land surveyor. It identifies the acreage. There are a few other requirements as well for the survey, so the post-award activities manual will give us, will provide you an overview of what goes into all of that. The closing statement is the closing statement for the purchase of the property. Sometimes we get the closing statement for the actual financing, which is not the right one. Typically, the closing statement is submitted, one, to confirm the purchase price, and then in the case of acquisition rehab developments, just going back and determining the acquisition place in service date. The title policy and policy update, well, that's pretty self-explanatory as far as the policy update. We're just going back and making sure that there aren't any mechanic liens filed on the property, that the land use restriction agreement is filed of record, and it should be identified on that policy update. The placement and service form, that's just a summary of the dates of placement and service for each building, the credit request for each building, and then it identifies the applicable credit percentage if it's 4% deal. Evidence of placement and service for a new construction development, this is typically the certificates of occupancy. For a rehab deal, there's usually an exhibit that is completed by the CPA and an exhibit that is completed by the architect. So it's just, again, confirming the dates that are elected as placed in service. The auditor's report, so the next bullet point, auditor's report on bond financing and the development cost schedule, those are the CPA exhibits. So the auditor report identifying how much the eligible basis was, the total cost amount, the report on bond financing just indicating that at least 50% of the aggregate basis was financed with taxes and bonds, and then the development cost schedule provides a summary of all of the costs for the deal. The final contractor's application for payment, the AIA G702, G703, that's the backup for the hard cost and contractor fees. Typically, we'll compare that to the development cost schedule numbers, and then any reconciliation or any difference would have to be reconciled. So this is a common item that we usually ask about. If there's any difference in the hard cost and contractor fees, we'll ask the owner to provide a summary of that. Documentation of offsite costs, if there are any offsite costs that are included in an eligible basis, there's an additional list of items that have to be submitted. Not a lot of deals have it, but it does apply when they are out there. The rent schedule, utility allowances, annual operating expenses, and long-term pro forma. That's just an overview of how the development is expected to operate. And we will do, similar to application underwriting, an analysis on our end to see if we agree with the proposed rents, the expenses, and then confirm the debt service. I will get into a little bit more detail about this later on. The current operating statement and rent roll, kind of the same type of thing. We'll use those for analysis, so we'll go ahead and break out the actuals and then look at the rent roll to see what rents are being collected, whether the applicable fractions are being met or they're different. So it's just kind of provided as backup to show how the development is doing and then to see how that compares to the proposed pro forma. The final sources and uses, that's a summary of all the capital funding sources that came into the deal. We do get backup for all of those, but again, it's just looking at whether the deal has enough sources or if it's oversourced or whatnot. So that's just a summary. The limited partnership agreement, pretty self-explanatory. It just provides backup to the sources and uses, and then there are other requirements within the OPA that impact the numbers that are used in other parts of the analysis. Obviously, the credit pricing, reserve requirements, developer fee amount. So all of that stuff is double-checked against the information included in the other sections. The loan documents, typically we would expect to see the note for the permanent loan, but a lot of times that is not the case since the loan hasn't been converted to permanent. So we'll have a commitment or something identifying the repayment terms, which again will match against the sources and uses and use for purposes of our analysis. The architect certification for accessible units, that is used to double check the information that is included in the LURA. So the architect is signing off on the mobility accessible units and the hearing and visual impaired accessible units. We'll go back and confirm those to what we have in the LURA, and if there are any differences, then we'll probably amend the LURA to make that correction. Assignment of compliance training and the certificate. So this is a requirement to take housing tax credit compliance training approved by the department. It has to be done within the last 2 years, and then an individual is assigned by the owner as the representative for that training. So yeah, it's just 2 pieces there. I mentioned the final inspection clearance letter. So typically you would need to have the final inspection closed before the 86 amendments are issued. But because of COVID, those are not being done. So that requirement is kind of on hold. Other documentation, this is typically underwriting conditions. They can vary. A lot of times it deals with the financing, environmental issues, all sorts of things. So if there were any underwriting conditions, they would typically be included under this last bullet point. Any questions so far from anyone?
Yes, Rosalio, you have a couple of questions. And I could chime in on either of these as well if you want some additional answers to these. The first question is, once packages and/or responses have been submitted to TDHCA, what is your ideal turnaround time? We've noticed from time to time, weeks to months with no responses from TDHCA.
Well, ideally, like I said, the initial review, once the initial package is submitted, it's 45 days or less. A follow-up request for information, we try to get to it within 30 days. And part of that, I will say as well, so you might note that all the asset management division handles a lot of processes. So cost certification is the most involved in it. We do spend a lot of time within it, but we also do a lot of other things. So ideally, we would be turning things around within a week or 2 weeks, but sometimes they do take longer. So it can vary depending on the workload that we have going on at that given time.
Yeah, and from that compliance review, when the file comes to the compliance division, if you're in the middle of a corrective action period, like let's say the cost certification comes to compliance today, and you had a file monitoring review in October where there were issues and your response is not due until January, we will reach out to you and say, hey, I know your response isn't due until January, but if you want to reply early, we'll expedite that review and move your 8609s along. So that's part of the delay with the release of the 8609s that from the compliance division, and that is a requirement in the asset management rule. And the next question says, why are the development summary with architect's certification to include the accessibility requirements necessary? These are asked at final construction, which is done pre-cost certification.
So Patricia, you might add to that one, but well, first of all, for the final inspection, I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Patricia, that the architect is signing off on the accessible units. I understand that the owner submits a final inspection request that identifies a list of accessible units, but they're not certified by an architect, or at least that's what I understood.
It's a requirement in 2306 that the agency is not able to provide assistance unless the owner certifies that the property does meet the requirements of the Fair Housing Act and other accessibility laws, which is what the final construction inspection confirms, that you are in compliance with those accessibility laws. So the reason that we're able to release the 8609s during COVID without this inspection is because we are relying on that certification. So without that certification, the agency actually is not able to provide assistance. And as you know, often there are issues that are discovered when we go out and do that final construction inspection that require corrections so that the property is actually accessible and in compliance with all of those laws. But so the agency has to get that certification from you. And I can't remember the the site from 2306, I'll look it up and provide it in the written answers too. Let me see if you have any other questions. The next question is, what is the process for requesting an extension for filing?
So that process is basically submitting a letter identifying the requested extension, why the need for the extension, and then depending on the timing, like I said, paying a fee. So that is submitted to the asset manager, and then I sign off on those extensions. So it's pretty simple.
Okay, Rosalio, it looks like that was all the questions.
Thank you, Patricia. So what are the most common mistakes at cost certification? Changes to the development or application that require an amendment, and I've touched on this. So the units, number of buildings, changes to the site plan. Common areas are a very common one. So statute only gives us a 3% reduction threshold. So for a small space, that doesn't take a lot. Unit square footages. So if any of these items require board approval, that is going to delay this process because, as you all know, the board meets about once a month, and submitting the amendment request has to be done in advance, so you can add a couple of months for that. Inconsistency across exhibits is a very common one. So up at the top on this slide, you'll see an example. So one number represents the rent schedule, another number represents the architect certification, and then another number represents the placement and service summary. So all of these numbers should be the net rentable area of this development, but there are some inconsistencies. So if you have market rate development, depending on what you're looking at, that would throw off the calculation for applicable fractions. And in some instances, it may not make a huge difference, but at the end, it's like, well, we do want to have accurate information throughout the package so that there isn't any confusion about what number is the right number. So yeah, so inconsistency across exhibits, that's just an example. There are other cross-referencing items that we look at, so just inconsistency in general. Sometimes there is parking and charge amenities, and those costs are not removed from eligible basis, so that'll result in a finding. And just as a reminder, the reduction for eligible basis needs to be reflected in Part 2 of the 8609. So once the cost certification process is complete and the 8609s are issued, the owner identifies the eligible basis in Part 2 of the 8609s. And if that is not reduced for any amenities that were generating secondary income, that would result in a finding from compliance. So just keep that in mind. I touched on the accessible unit differences. So that exhibit that the architect signs off on is compared to the LURA. And if there are any differences, if in fact the LURA is incorrect, that would require an amendment to the LURA. So adding time to the review and approval process. In some instances, the rents that are used and the utility allowances that are used are no longer up to date. So we go in and make adjustments, and that can throw off the pro forma. So just keep an eye out for that as you're preparing the cost certification package. Typically, outside of COVID, not having requested the final inspection at the time of the cost certification, absent of this current situation, this is probably the one item that can result in the longest delay. As you know, you submit an inspection request, it has to then be scheduled. The inspector goes out, identifies findings. Most of the inspections don't come out clean without findings. So there's always something to correct. So the corrections have to be made, responses have to be submitted. And once that's done, reviewed and cleared. So that process can take several months. If the inspection request hasn't been submitted, that will create a significant delay in the approval of the 8609s. Another common issue is having a projected debt coverage ratio, or DCR, outside of the underwriting guidelines of 115 to 150. One thing I will add to that is that we do our own analysis, and if there are significant differences, your pro forma may show that you're at a 150 DCR or less, but if we cannot get to your numbers for whatever reason, we might show that the development is over a 150, and that will be a problem. So yeah, just be able to support whatever pro forma that you submit with backup either in the form of actuals or if you have any comparable developments, point us to those so that we can get comfortable with the projected DCR. In terms of the cost schedule, sometimes there are reserves that are not supported, so lease-up reserves is a common one, or some reserves that are not allowed by the rules. So we'll take those out from our analysis, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit more in the subsequent slide. The application of contractor fees and developer fees are not within the allowed limits. Sometimes this is because there are other miscellaneous costs that contain additional fees, which were not classified correctly. The same goes with change orders and other costs that reflect fees that need to be classified as part of the contractor fee and therefore reduce the total amount allowed. And then for developer fee, some related party construction management fees or services related to developer. So developer services in accordance with the rule. So we'll go back and look at whatever services were provided and then determine whether those needed to be included as part of the developer fee limit. Any questions about any of this so far?
You have a question. I'm not that familiar with your content, so I don't know if it's related to it or not, but here's your question. How does TDHCA determine OpEx and DSC at cost serve as actual OpEx are often not stabilized at submission based off of closing numbers or initial application? Does that make sense to you, what she's asking?
Yes. So operating expenses.
Thank you.
Yeah, so ideally we would have a stabilized property and we could rely on the actuals, but that is correct. If we have a property that was just recently constructed, we have a database that includes all of our properties. So we have that as a standard number that we look at. And then there's a lot of sources that we have available. So we can narrow it down to comparable properties within the area, comparable properties from the same developer. For numbers such as property taxes, we can use the appraisal district's number, but we also have the ability to go in and come up with the number based on the NOI, so just the income approach. Other things that we look into, we have requirements of reserves, so that would be in the LPA. In terms of management fee, that's in the LPA, and we often ask for a management agreement. Sometimes there's a contract for supported services. So a lot of the numbers, even though they may not be reflected in the actuals, they can be obtained from other sources. Payroll, that one, depending on the status of the deal, we may have to look at comparables. So there are a few like utilities that we always have a hard time with just because it varies by deal, but we come up with the best set of numbers that we have that we can based on the available data. So it's not necessarily based on the numbers that we had at application, but it's more on whatever data is available now. So we'll just redo an underwriting analysis at COSER with updated information. For property insurance, we'll get an invoice. So a lot of this can be obtained even though the deal hasn't really stabilized. And what was the second part of that question, Patricia?
Let me see.
Operating expenses, and there was something else.
Is it based on closing numbers or initial application? Did you answer?
It's more closing numbers, but even then it's kind of running a new analysis based on the latest data.
Okay. The next question you have is, will you be going into more detail about construction management fees and how they apply in relation to contractor fee limits or developer fee limits?
I don't have anything further on that, but I guess I can elaborate on that a little bit more.
Maybe I can ask him to ask a more specific question, or?
Yeah, I think it can depend. So we have if there's more of a specific question, we can deal with that outside of this or not. But nowadays we're starting to see where there are related party construction management agreements. And our rules have certain requirements. So refer to the rules in effect of the year of the award as a starting point to see what we allow or don't allow in terms of related parties. But if it's still not clear, sometimes we do have to run it up the chain to our legal department just to make sure that it falls within the requirements or it doesn't. This can be a gray area, so it's not a very clear answer that I can just tell you, yeah, this would be allowed or it wouldn't be allowed, because there are different factors that go into allowing or not allowing.
Okay. Another question that you got is, could you get Rosalio to comment on any big changes in the way cost certifications are reviewed in 2021 and beyond? We've been doing cost certifications for a while. We're just wondering if there are any changes in direction, methodology, or pet peeves.
Well, I mean, I have been reading cost certs since 2007. We haven't had a big change in it. There's nothing planned so far in 2021. But the purpose of this roundtable is to gather any input as far as any suggestions for changes or anything like that. I mean, I think so far I've covered what our intent is in doing this review. So if we can still achieve the same goal, but doing it a little bit different that maybe would be more efficient, I'm open to suggestions. But so far, we don't have any big changes in mind for 2021.
All right, that's all your questions.
Okay, thank you. So other trending items that have come up recently. So the IRS Audit Technique Guide, and in particular, tenant relocation cost and bond issuance cost. I know that the IRS Audit Technique Guide was issued in draft form in 2013. Comments were submitted to the IRS and they came out with the final version in 2014. Both tenant relocation costs and bond issuance costs, in accordance with the Audit Technique Guide, are not included in basis. Recently, the question of bond issuance cost was asked of the IRS because we're starting to see deals where bonds are really used for construction only, so the construction period, and then upon conversion, they go into a more conventional loan. So the question was asked, in that instance, can the bond issuance cost be included in basis? And the answer is no. It's still bond issuance cost, and they are not allowed. Tenant relocation costs, there has been a lot of discussion about those, kind of the same argument. But at the end of the day, the IRS Audit Technique Guide, I understand that it may not be authoritative, but it is the guidance that we have from the IRS. So absent of anything more recent or more direct as it relates to these items, we have to follow what the IRS says. And these are two examples of what have come up in terms of the audit guide, but there have been other things that are within the audit guide that may apply. So I just wanted to mention these two items. So once we do our analysis, ultimately the goal is to have the 8609s issued. And then the 8609s will reflect a credit amount that is going to be the lesser of the originally approved credit amount in the case of a 9% development. In the case of 4% development, the credit amount can go up or down. If it goes up from what the determination notice amount identifies, there is a fee associated with that. And if the increase is of 10% or greater, it requires board approval. We don't see that a lot, but it does happen. The eligible basis amount, so that's typically the amount that is issued for 4% deal, so going up or down is based on eligible basis. And then the financing gap amount. So this is the amount of funds necessary to fill the gap created by housing development costs less sources that are not coming from the department. So typically a deal will have permanent debt and equity as the two minimum sources, and in some instances there's a need for deferred developer fee. This analysis for the financing gap amount is based on a net of any cost adjustments, which I will talk on in the subsequent slide. And something that people may or may not realize is that it's impacted by the pro forma. So if there's a deal that has a DCR projected of 1.5 or greater than 1.5, then that's an indicator that the development could have supported more debt. The 1.5 DCR is really a measure of subsidy. If you have a deal that has a DCR greater than that, it just means that, okay, it may be over subsidized. In some cases, you might have a deal that has a low debt structure, So as long as there's a significant amount of deferred developer fee, we would analyze it as deferring that or amortizing that deferred developer fee at the same terms as the first lien debt and see if we can bring down the DCR to a 150 or less. If that's the case, then the deal is not really over-subsidized. But if we don't have that room in there and the deal still has a 150 DCR greater than a 150 DCR, then that means that it should have obtained more debt. We're not requiring that they get more debt, but for credit sizing purposes, we will include an additional debt amount and say, well, once you take that into consideration, then the deal needed fewer credits, and that's the amount that we would recommend absent of doing anything else with the cost. And I'll touch on that a little bit more in a subsequent slide. So what are the common cost adjustments? So the owner submits a cost certification that the CPA signed off on, and then TDHCA reviews it and says, well, we do have a few differences, and we're going to have to adjust the owner's cost for some of these things. So the acquisition value, in the case of an AC rehab deal, the allocation between land and buildings, that typically would have been addressed at the time of application underwriting. It's based on an appraisal, or that's one of the factors that goes into it. And sometimes we'll get the question of, well, we have a new appraisal. And the answer to that question is usually, well, we won't take that into account because the appraisal submitted at application was accepted. There weren't any issues with it. So usually what we see is that the same allocation of land and buildings that was done at application underwriting by TDHCA is done by TDHCA at COSERD. So it shouldn't be a new issue, but sometimes we do see that even though it was identified at the time of application underwriting, it still has a different set of numbers. Another common adjustment on the acquisition is the identity of interest. So if the land or property was owned by a related party, we do have rules about that. I won't go into a lot of detail, but basically it means that we would use a acquisition cost that is lower than what the owner may have submitted. And then excess land, we don't see this a whole lot. And again, it would have probably been addressed at the time of application. If there is excess land that is bought initially, but only a portion is being used and restricted for the development, then we would prorate the amount that is actually used. And the rules go into a little bit more detail about how that is determined, but just know that that could reduce the acquisition value that is used by the TDHCA analyst. Contractor fees, I talked about that earlier. So misclassification of overhead general requirements. A lot of times going through the G702, G703 and change orders, there are costs that we would consider overhead and general requirements. So temporary utilities, security during construction. What else is a common one? Let's see. So yeah, those are the more common ones. Supervision, so general supervision, that's also included in there. There could be others. So going through it, if the CPA and the owner only included the line items for contractor profit, overhead, and general requirements, but there are other things in there, then we would classify those as contractor fees, which may put them over the limit. Related parties of prime.
I'm sorry, This is Dan. Could I add to that the contractor fees, make certain that they're also looking at the change orders, because that's where I see a lot of those fees missed.
Yeah, so definitely. So in addition to the G702, G703, if there are change orders, we will ask for a copy of the change orders and then identify that there were, in fact, contractor fees within the change orders that were not included or classified as such in the cost schedule. So that could put the deal over on the contractor fee requirement that the owner may not have been considering. Again, on related parties and prime subcontractors, the rules determine what is considered a related party and or prime subcontractor. If you have any of those, then any fees paid to them would be considered part of the contractor fee limit. We don't see this a whole lot, but it is included in our rules, and just keep that in mind if you do have them. Developer and consulting fees, developer services, I touched on that a little bit. So the rules, the underwriting rules, or even the QAP, I think, have a definition for developer services. So we'll go back and look at what those are, compare them to the proposed cost, and see whether it is to be classified as part of the developer fee. And then we see from time to time developer G&A. So the cost schedule does have a line item for developer G&A, but it's rarely used. And it is part of the developer fee limit. So any travel associated for the developer to the site, meals, lodging, so anything that is not necessarily tied to the construction of the development, more of a just necessary expense for the developer, would be classified as part of that 15% limit or 20% depending on your deal. Reserves, the operating reserve. Under our rules, the operating reserve has to be held for at least 5 years. We will look at the limited partnership agreement for that. In some instances, it's a little unclear because it may require an initial deposit, but then that amount can be reduced at a later time, like let's say once the deal stabilizes, then we would only use the amount that's actually required to be held for at least 5 years. The lease-up reserve, in contrast to application, by the time a deal is submitted for cost certification, we should know what the actual costs are. So any lease-up reserve that we include in our analysis should be justified by the operating deficit. So we'll go back and look at the operating statements for the deal and then see if there were in fact any operating deficits that would at least add up to the amount included for the lease-up reserve. If that is not the case, even though the limited partnership agreement may identify a lease-up reserve, generally the LPAs will say that that lease-up reserve is to be released once the deal stabilizes. So we wouldn't really take that into consideration if in fact the deal didn't have operating deficits. Another thing to keep in mind is other reserves that are not allowed by the rules. We see these from time to time, so capitalized asset management fees, guarantee reserves, tenant services reserves, or anything that has to do kind of with future operations of the deal. We don't capitalize any of those. Operating reserves really should be intended for whatever the deal can't support if it can't meet its obligations for operations, but anything like asset management fees, tenant services, all of those should be paid out of operations going forward without the need for a reserve. So under our rules, they are not allowed. So what if you have a deal that is being gapped in the credit amount? So the sources exceed the uses. The QAP and the underwriting rules section has two options for owners. One is doing a special reserve account, and this is really to assist tenants living at the property. The more common uses are rental and utility assistance, but it's pretty open-ended as long as it benefits the tenant and it's something above and beyond what is already required. That reserve can be used for that purpose. It is limited to $2,500 per unit, and if that's done, the owner will have to open up the account, provide information about the account, and then our legal department will draft a special reserve account agreement, and then prior to the 86 months being issued, we need to see that the account has been funded. So it takes a little bit of time to get that done, but at least it saves from having to return credits or at least reduce the amount that has to be returned. Another option is having the owner build additional tenant amenities. That is limited to 1.5% of the originally underwritten hard cost, but this one can also take some time because you have to complete the amenities, and then it is likely that the amenities would be added as an additional requirement into the LURA, so we would have to amend the LURA for that as well. So at least if you're dealing with a development that has too much in credits, or what it seems like it, this is a way to preserve some of those credits. Other than that, that is pretty much I had in my presentation. Are there any other questions at this time?
I wouldn't really call this a question, but you got a comment that you might want to respond to that says the timing of the cost cert submission deadline can be a little tight. For instance, developments placed in service in 2020 have a deadline of January 15th, 2021 for cost cert submission. When doing phased occupancy, this can be difficult.
Yeah, so that's really, it stems from 9% development. So the IRS allows us to recapture and reuse any credits within 180 days from the end of the first year of the credit period. So right around the end of June, let's say, so let's say in that example, development that began the credit period in 2020, they have 180 days from the end of 2020 to return any credits and allow us to recapture and reallocate them to another development. So having a deadline of January 15th gives us enough time to review and get comfortable with the credit amount to determine whether or not there needs to be a return. If there is a return after that deadline, TDHCA cannot reuse the credits. So the rules say if you have any deals that can't support the credits at cost, and this is 9% developments, and those credits are not returned within 180 days after the end of the first year of the credit period, then the owner has to pay a penalty fee equal to the $1 amount of the credits, so for 1 year. And then obviously the credits wouldn't be issued to the deal. So there would be a reduction to the credit amount, and then the owner pays a penalty fee of that amount. So we try to get the cost certifications as early as possible for that reason. But again, you do have the ability to request an extension. If you have a deal that is being built in phases where some buildings may be placed in service in 2020, but some of them are going to be placed in service in 2021, because of the 2020 placement in service date and credit period election, you have to request an extension saying, well, we can't really submit a cost cert without having the rest of the buildings done. And at that point, we would approve it, so you would have more time to submit it. We just like to know what's going on with the deal. If you can't submit the cost cert by that time, we understand, but just understand that that's the reasoning why we ask for it so early.
Okay, other questions are, consulting fees reviewed and considered under the developer fee limit?
Typically, yes. So we would, again, look at what services were being provided. Anytime we see consulting services outside of the developer fee, we do ask the question, what was that for? Just because a lot of times we do determine that they have to be or should be classified as part of the developer fee. But again, it's looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, and so far this is your last question. So if anyone else wants to submit a question, now is the time. But the last question we've got so far is, can you go back and explain in a little more detail about the special reserve account option for the financing gap?
Yes, so that amount can be up to $2,500 per unit in the development. So that's how much that's the maximum number that we could set aside into the special reserve account. The amount, well, I guess we would do an analysis of how much the deal is oversourced, either it being strictly sources and uses or because of DCR. And we would say, okay, you need to deposit, or you have the option to deposit up to $2,500 per unit. The amount can be less than $2,500 per unit. So if the deal only needs a little more in cost and it's less than $2,500 per unit, that's the amount that the owner would have to deposit to preserve the credits that they were allocated up front. As far as what dictates and how that is documented, once we agree on the amount, the owner has to open up an account. So it's an account that the owner controls, but any withdrawals from that account would have to be approved by TDHCA in the future. So they open up the account, they give us the account information, and that is then translated into an actual special reserve account agreement. So that agreement is drafted by the department's legal department, signed by both the owner and TDHCA, and that is the agreement that governs how that account is going to be used and identifies the term of it and so forth. So basically, determine the amount of the special reserve, open up an account, enter into an agreement. I don't know if that addresses the question that they had.
Sounds good to me. Okay, you've got one more question. If the GC contract is 12% fees, will TDHCA allow a 14% calculation, effectively allowing a 2% point margin?
If the cost was not paid, we don't. If it was paid to some other party, then we would need to see an agreement. So cost certification should be whatever costs were actually incurred. So if they entered into an agreement for a 12% fee, great. But if that difference is not being paid to anybody else, then we would not include it.
Okay, you got another one. What change from the application will need to have a request for an amendment?
Oh, it's a whole list and under statute, under the rules. It can vary. We see all types of things. Like I mentioned, changes in the square footage reductions are the big ones. If it exceeds 3% or more, that requires board approval. Changes in the number of buildings, changes in the residential density of at least 5% require board approval. Sometimes that happens just because of right-of-way dedications that were not expected at application. So those are the more common ones, but it doesn't mean that those are the only ones that would require approval. I would refer you to the rules just to kind of go through and say what kinds of things would fall under that. Sometimes even a change in developer or guarantor requires approval. It's less involved, but that's considered a change from the application as well.
Rosalie, I would just like to add to that, that if there are any questions regarding whether or not a change has happened and if it needs to be a material amendment or non-material amendment, feel free to reach out to your asset manager. They'll be more than happy to help you with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's something that I've mentioned before is any questions that come up even as you're preparing the cost certification. If you need assistance with anything, feel free to ask the asset manager or reach out to me as well. And we can provide you some guidance even before you submit the cost cert. If you wait until the cost cert is submitted, then you're going to wait until it's reviewed and then it's issued as a finding and have to respond to all of that. But you're always welcome to reach out to the asset manager directly with questions.
Okay, and you have one more. From an equity gap analysis, how would TDHCA view a reduced permanent loan? For example, the original loan was $20 million, but due to NOI, the lender will only allow $18 million. Would TDHCA still underwrite the gap analysis with the original $20 million loan contemplated?
No, so at cost certification, we get new loan documents. Most of the time, the terms for that financing will be different than what was projected at application. So the interest rate has changed, amortization period changed as well. So changing the loan amount is kind of a function of all of those. And yes, if the NOI has changed, then that will play a role. Either, reducing the loan amount or being able to support a higher loan amount. So we don't necessarily limit the loan amount to what was identified at application. We'll analyze the deal based on the new information provided and make sure that it falls within the underwriting guidelines. So still 115 to 150 DCR. But yeah, we don't hold deals to the debt amount that was proposed at application.
Okay, next question. What is the frequency of 9% developments being oversourced at cost cert?
Nowadays, it's less frequent, but it does happen. If I had to come up with a percentage, I would probably say less than 10% of the deals that we look at have it. And the amounts are a lot lower considering that the maximum DCR limit used to be 135. And that changed over the last few years to 150. And now with this option to do a special reserve account, that allows a lot of the deals to preserve the credit. So it's fewer deals and the amounts are lower.
All right, Rosalio, I think you made it. I don't have any more questions coming in that you have not answered?
Thank you, Patricia, for taking all these questions for me. So now, yeah, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel for future reference. And if you have any questions, my contact information is on the screen. Feel free to reach out. And again, thank you all for being in this roundtable.